Dear audience, it is my greatest pleasure to welcome you to this year's Army Summit. We find ourselves in the midst of a global pandemic, forcing us not only to adapt our strategic behavior and responses, but also the way we interact with each other. Army Summit is an annual event attracting policymakers and the extended security and defense establishment across Norway. Army Summit is hosted by the Chief of the Norwegian Army alongside the Norwegian Atlantic Committee. A fun fact is, I've worked for both. This year's event will be fully virtual, but nonetheless an important platform for raising some of the most pressing defense and security-related issues at a crucial time in Norway's national planning. You might also have heard about the attempts to interfere with this year's event by unknown intruders that have created several fake events, highlighting the new realities where soldiers have to deal with the challenges in the interface between the physical and virtual domain. The current crisis has highlighted the need for readiness, agility, and resilience in the face of an increasingly unpredictable world. At this year's Army Summit, we would like to dig deeper into how friends and allies can work together, fight shoulder to shoulder at a time when our shared and common values are under immense pressure and financial resources become scarce. The next 3 days will hopefully set the stage for valuable exchanges, keeping both the global outlook while at the same time addressing some of the key debates on the future of Norway's armed forces and defense policy. I am so thrilled to be part of this year's event alongside a long list of distinguished speakers and defining leaders of our time. Of course, there would be no virtual event without our beloved audience. We strongly encourage you to take part during the sessions. Please submit your questions at the window to your right in the browser at any time during the session. If you want to address your question directly to a speaker, mention the speaker's name followed by your question. You can also like other questions that will be popping up in the browsers to increase their chance of being asked. We also encourage those of you who might be interested to check out the extra material on the website. Well, I guess it's time to start. To open this year's Army Summit, please welcome the Norwegian Minister of Defense, Frank Bakke-Jensen.
Dear friends, welcome to this year's Army Summit. 75 years ago, the Allies won the Second World War. The strategic lessons learned during that war are still crucial to Norwegian security and defense policy. The main lesson was that our security challenge would have to be met together with our allies. In the world's most powerful defense alliance, where the primary purpose is to prevent war, NATO is the pillar of our security framework. However, a defense alliance is only as credible as the sum of its members. We hear the US message that Europe must take its fair share of responsibility, and we will do our part. In the middle of next month, this government will present the new long-term defense plan to our parliament. The plan introduces measures to ensure the continued relevance of our armed forces. Armed forces that are robust and adaptable in order to address both current and future challenges. A continued increase in defense spending will reduce operational capability gaps and strengthen readiness and endurance. This plan will improve our national capability as well as enhance our ability to receive allied reinforcements and to deploy forces to operations abroad. In the coming years, the armed forces will introduce a number of new capacities and begin several major upgrades of existing capacities and platforms. The government proposes to strengthen and further develop the army with increased firepower, higher readiness, and increased sustainability. Brigade North will be developed with 4 maneuver battalions with tactical and logistical support. The maneuver battalions will be equipped with new main battle tanks, mobile air defense systems, and long-range precision fire. The fully mechanized brigade will meet a vital NATO capability target for Norway. We are increasing our presence in the land domain in the north. The strengthening of Finnmark land defense continues, with both the cavalry battalion and the border guard. The modernization of the Home Guard will also continue, including an increased capacity to forward stage weapons, ammunition, and other supplies. The number of forces in the Home Guard will remain at today's level at 40,000. However, capabilities are not everything. Actual high quality and capable contributions are also important. That's why we participate in the enhanced forward presence in Lithuania. Our armed forces must continue to be prepared and capable of contributing to the security of our allies, as well as our own. We aim to continue our participation in the EFP, as well as our commitment to provide high-quality forces to the NATO High Readiness Response Force. Norway also attaches great value to our good bilateral relations and cooperation with close allies. The United States remains our most important ally. We are also seeking cooperation and mutually beneficial agreements amongst other like-minded nations, such as UK, the Netherlands, France, and Germany. Last week, my Swedish and Finnish colleagues and I signed an agreement to further strengthen the cooperation between our countries on defense. Nordic cooperation makes sense, as it's likely that a threat against one affects us all. Moreover, despite our different history and alliance policy, we remain a closely knit region. That said, it's important to stress that these initiatives are all supplemental to NATO and within the NATO framework. In recent years, we have seen a deterioration in our security environment. Increased instability, great power rivalry, as well as new self-assertive actors on the global stage all contribute to this trend. The combination of credible deterrence and reassurance across the full spectrum of peace, crisis, and armed conflict is becoming more important. This implies that Norway needs a strong and well-prepared national defense in order to face these challenges together with NATO and our allies. Societal resilience is a key element to Norwegian security, and our overall defense efforts relies heavily on a whole-of-government approach. The pandemic has led to increased uncertainty in all sectors of society. However, the hallmark of our armed forces is the ability to operate and develop further in the midst of uncertainty and unpredictability. In fact, historically, crises have demanded rapid changes to armed forces to handle the crisis at hand, rather than the one that was planned for. Churchill famously said, "Never let a good crisis go to waste." A crisis is sometimes what is needed to gain traction and force reform and change. The Army, as well as the rest of our defense community, have taken great strides towards digitalization during the pandemic, as indicated by this year's Army Summit. This government has decided to update Norwegian defense concept. The defense of Norway has three main lines of effort. The first is our national defense. The second is the collective defense within the framework of NATO. And the third is bilateral support and reinforcement arrangements with our closest allies. Reinforcing these lines of effort through investing in our armed forces supports our overall defense policy goal: to protect and defend Norwegian sovereignty, territorial integrity, democratic institutions, and freedom of action against political, military, and other measures. This triangle rests on our total defense concept. The total defense concept will also be further developed in light of the lesson learned during the current crisis, as well as adapted to future trends. Norwegian participation in NATO operations and readiness forces is an integral part of the overall defense effort. Building the necessary capabilities within our armed forces to meet current and future strategic challenges is my primary goal. That is also the reason why the government proposes to continue to further strengthen our armed forces. even in a period where our national economy is under pressure. One of the most important factors in any armed force, it is people. In Norway, we are fortunate that our national service allows us to recruit amongst the best of our youth. It is imperative that we use this resource wisely, that our young conscripts experience a meaningful service, and that the best among them want a career in the defense sector. However, we are also looking at ways to broaden our recruitment. The main criteria must be to enhance our armed forces, especially as new technology makes an impact in all parts of society. We are also reforming the national service in other ways to help increase readiness and operational capabilities. We are establishing separate basic training facilities. We will recruit several times throughout the year to ensure that the operational capability remains stable. Taken together, these measures increases the continuous operational capability, availability and readiness of our armed forces. We are also increasing the length of the required service for several categories of conscripts. Being prepared for the next crisis requires resilience, readiness and relevance. Relevance in that we are continuously present with modern and capable forces. Readiness in that our personnel are trained, motivated and equipped to meet any challenges. Resilience in that we are able to continue our efforts through the initial phases of any conflict and to receive, integrate and fight alongside our allies. The Army is working towards all these goals, thanks in part to the extraordinary efforts of its personnel. Thus, it is doing its part in securing our national interests and values in the face of an ever-changing and more complex security landscape. So that, if called upon, we are ready to meet our future security challenges together with our allies and partners. Thank you for your attention.
The next speaker is right at the center of the ongoing debate about the future of the Norwegian armed forces and land power past the pandemic. The other day, I met a Norwegian recruit who was so frustrated that his military service coincided with a global pandemic. And I'm very sure that General Lars Lervik agrees with that sentiment as someone who assumed his new role as Chief of the Norwegian Army right when the entire country, and in fact the entire world, went into a complete lockdown. General, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Aisha. Dear friends, first of all, I'd like to thank our Defense Minister, Frank Bakke-Jensen, for opening the conference. We really appreciate having you here and you sharing your perspective. For its first 10 years, the Army Summit was held in a different world. Several hundred people together in a grand concert hall at the Akershus Fortress, shaking hands and sharing seats. Today, we are beaming to you across the internet, 3 short broadcasts rather than 1 full day, socially distant and straight into your living room or your forward operating base. Our completely redesigned format this year is a vivid reminder of how fast circumstances change, and an illustration of how the Army must continuously adjust and adapt to keep solving its mission. The ongoing pandemic has highlighted the need for readiness, agility, and resiliency in the face of an increasingly unpredictable world. The current crisis came on in a few weeks, acting as a catalyst for underlying forces set in motion decades ago, all pushing the world towards greater instability. In the lead-up to this event, we had an incident, as already mentioned, on our social media platforms where unwelcome actors attempted to hijack our audience. This is another example of how our daily operations increasingly takes place in the virtual and cognitive domains, all in addition to the physical. The Army acted immediately in response to these incidents and jointly with the cyber defense, civilian authorities and our private contractors increased our security, hopefully to a sufficient level so that you all can enjoy this conference. The future is now. Being ready tomorrow is too late. Numbers and tables of warships, missiles, planes and soldiers have long filed defense intelligence analysts' presentations. Perhaps the biggest shift in the threat landscape today is the change in how war is waged. Our opponents reject the traditionally binary view of peace and war. Their reality is a constant condition where they see as a continual struggle. A large part of this struggle exists in what has come to be known as the gray zone. That is, activities below the threshold of open conflict. From a Russian perspective, this is an integral part of what is referred to as nonlinear war or new generation warfare. In their view, this is more a reflection of the modern character of war rather than a new doctrine from their part. They have a point. This gray zone includes familiar tactics like disinformation, spying, and assassinations, but it can involve more muscular interventions. Ben Wallace, Britain's defense secretary, has pointed to the Wagner Group as an example, a mercenary force that serves as a deniable arm of Russian power in several war zones. Responding to gray zone is hard. Provocations like information campaigns hardly justify sending in tanks. This opens the risk of a salami-slicing approach, inducing chaos, paralyzing a government, or seizing limited but strategically important pieces of terrain. Most Western armed forces lack the legal authority to jump into a peacetime crisis with guns blazing. And in many instances, if you ask me, this is neither desirable or ethical. In Norway, our total defense concept provides the conceptual framework for countering such challenges. This system is somewhat unique and efficient, and it can be an area where Norway provides solutions other countries can model after us. We in the Army will continue to take an active role in reviving and further promoting the total defense concept. But a singular approach and a singular emphasis on gray zone threats, technological solutions, and niche capabilities is fraught with risk. As smaller nations specialize, the more they need to rely on bigger allies to fill any gaps. As Dr. David Bladen of the University of Exeter pointed out to The Economist recently, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, often held up as a defining example of gray zone war, involved several armored divisions and wield nuclear threats, which is hardly something you can counter only with commandos, drones, and cyber attacks. Betting on futuristic weapons while retiring proven capabilities is a high-stake gamble, said Dr. Bladen. I believe that a full spectrum capability gives political room to maneuver. I believe an independent nation needs the freedom of choice and the physical ability to deal with this wide range of threats. It challenges our traditional Western liberal democratic ideas, both on how conflicts are played out and on a systemic level. The trends are pointing in the wrong direction and going there increasingly fast. From an army perspective, I wish to emphasize the high-intensity part of this equation. Not that the lower-intensity tactics are unimportant. This quote has been read at the Army Summit before, but I will do it again. The Russian Deputy Minister of Defense and General of the Army, General Dmitry Bulgakov, offered his view on the necessity of mechanized land forces. Quote, "Our experience from Syria has shown that that achieving goals in armed conflict without the land forces is impossible. Tanks are still and will continue to be in the foreseeable future the most important battle platforms for land warfare. In the end, it is only after having secured ground that one can speak of military success. Armored materiel remains the most flexible. Regardless of the gains from long-range precision missiles, space warfare, and naval forces, it cannot replace gaining and securing land with boots on the ground." End quote. In 2018 and 2019, Russia extended and upgraded its regional forces, including mechanized and naval infantry, plus positioned modernized T-80 main battle tanks on the Kola Peninsula, just a few kilometers from the Norwegian and Finnish border. In total, on the Russian side, open sources describe a doubling of their national main battle tank stock, whereas about 1,200 of these have been upgraded and modernized recently. It is in this reality we in the Norwegian Army find our mission, given to us by our democratically elected leaders. We need the right tools to be relevant on every level of conflict. A nation exists in an international society. Norway has chosen its place in this society as an independent, liberal democracy. We fight to safeguard our right to keep this position and societal contract on many levels. Militarily, we do it with our defense forces. In the larger context, through NATO. Our trusted allies are in many ways our last line of defense to remain the nation we want to be, and reflects our lessons learned 75, 80 years ago. The alliance rightfully has expectations of its members. The weight each member gives these commitments accumulates to the total amount of weight and credibility the alliance itself carries. NATO has specific force requirements for Norway, politically agreed by our heads of states and governments. As of now, Norway does not meet the land force criteria. NATO holds this as the most significant weakness of the Norwegian armed forces. I hope that the new long-term plan addresses these critical shortfalls, and I'm very pleased to hear that what the Secretary of Defense said about what he is planning to propose to the Parliament. And I'm looking forward to the discussions and the decision from the Norwegian Parliament in a short while. NATO does its planning and has a strong idea of how to solve its mission. A rigorous planning process in the alliance leads to the force requirements for each nation. It is therefore comforting to me to know that there is a close to 100% overlap between what NATO sees as Norway's needs and what our own processes concludes with, both the Land Forces study and more recently the Chief of Defense Military Advice. We know what is needed, now we need just to get there. With born digital soldiers, evolved methodologies, and technologically supporting it, we find our soldiers relating to their tasks more holistically. We operate in the physical and virtual and cognitive terrain, simultaneously and naturally. My job is to bring this new reality to us as soon as possible and enable our soldiers to thrive and win in it. The new Army concept, due to be published later this year, will be our guide. I believe Norway needs a balanced defense. Balanced in the way that we independently can face full spectrum operations before our allies come to help us. Later, that we are able to fight shoulder to shoulder with our allies, both at home and abroad. This means a combination of denial and long-range capabilities with ability to conduct presence, include armor, and have a sufficient adequate volume. Our vision is an army with flexibility in technology, rich in human competencies, and adequate depth in volume. An army soldier might still end up fighting an enemy using only his or her hands. Feel, hear, and smell the other person as they fight for their lives. This remains the harsh reality of war. Procedures and technologies are necessary pieces, but does not get us all the way. Trust, knowing each other together with a relentless will to fight, is what brings us success. Regardless of time and technological innovations, the vast majority of our conflicts take place, and are resolved on land, where people live. Few, if any, armed conflicts have ever been settled without deploying land forces to secure people, infrastructure, and terrain, allowing for civilian authorities to return and create lasting peace and stability. In this effort, we have some great friends, and you will meet some of them later. We are all very much looking forward to listening to and speaking with General Jim Mattis in a few minutes. His contributions to both the way we military folks conduct business and to international politics as Secretary of Defense has been immense. We are honored to have him with us. Tomorrow, I will, together with the Chief of the Navy and the Chief of the Air Force, discuss possible approaches to our future both high and low intensity conflicts. As far as I'm aware, this is the first time we open up these kinds of discussions on the force chief levels to the public. I'm really excited about what we have to share with you. My colleague, General Hodges, will speak on Wednesday about the importance of military and civilian relations in face of the pandemic and growing uncertainty. He will be followed by our brilliant Minister of Foreign Affairs, who will talk about Norway's place in the evolving international environment. I look forward to their insight and hope that you all will take advantage of our online tools and engage with them. In closing, I hope that our concept for the Army Summit this year will be an experience which is as interesting and engaging, maybe even more convenient and accessible than before. Going forward, we will take what we learned from this format to hopefully give you a better experience, both in person and online next year. On behalf of the Secretary General of the Norwegian Atlantic Committee, Ms. Kate Hansen Bundt, and the Norwegian Army, it is my pleasure to welcome you to this year's Army Summit. I'll leave you in the capable hands of our host, Aisha Wolasmal. Take it away, Aisha.
Throughout history, we see nations with allies thrive and nations without allies wither. These are the words of none other than retired General Jim Mattis. Our next speaker has had a remarkable military career, having served in the Persian Gulf, Iraq, and Afghanistan. During his most recent tenure as Secretary of Defense of the United States of America, he once again reminded us of his firm devotion and commitment to global alliances. He continues to be a voice of reason and intellect in an increasingly temperamental world. His leadership skills continue to inspire new generations of soldiers and practitioners at home and abroad, including right here in Norway. If we were to conduct an informal mapping of General Mattis's global fan base, I am sure that Norway would rank pretty high. General, it's an exceptional honor and privilege to have you with us at this year's Army Summit. Over to you.
Well, thank you, Aisha. It's a pleasure to be here. Good evening to all of you. And General Lervik, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm honored to join with you soldiers of Norway tonight. It was good to once again listen to Minister Bak-Jensen, old friend. Absolute delight to hear you. I noticed in 2 days, Minister Soryeda, the former Minister of Defense, will be addressing the summit as well. This sends quite a message of the priority that the government is placing on the land forces in Norway, a very heartening development. Due to COVID, of course, I'm joining you from a long distance, 7,400 kilometers away, but please rest assured, I'm right there with you in spirit. Because as an American and as a U.S. Marine, we don't forget our key ally on the northern flank, an ally who for 4 decades taught Marines so much about living and fighting in the North. an ally who landed in Kandahar, Afghanistan, shortly after my country was attacked on 9/11, and infusing confidence in ethical battlefield performance across the forces that joined us there. And it was thanks to your Army's calm expertise and their example that they were able to send that note of confidence through other international forces. Also, you're an ally that many Marines find much in common with, because as a naval force, we cannot solve problems with mass. So we find your problem-solving approach to tactical realities as being something we have a lot in common with. I also want to point out yesterday, Sunday, here in America, was the Gold Star Mother's Day, where we recognized the mothers of the troops killed in action and recognize the grief that those mothers carry. We also know that you have mothers in Norway who have lost their sons, and we share in our respect for those mothers and the level of grief that they must carry with them for always. For more than a century, Norway and the United States has built an enduring bond bolstered by our shared values and today by our need for a strong transatlantic unity. And we don't take this bond for granted. We know we have to continue working on it. Human relations either get better or weaker, and we are committed to making them better. I think that I'm here today to pay my respects to you for that bond, but also compare thoughts in our continuing collaboration and sharing candid views as only trusted allies do. In American sports terms, Norway's military is always boxed above its weight class. It always contributes more than its numbers alone. And from my years as a NATO commander and then as Secretary of Defense, I always knew that when NATO gave her word, she would deliver. That when I met my counterparts, Minister Soyeda and Minister Bak-Jensen, I would walk away better informed, but also heartened by this steadfast, competent allies' strategic and military contributions. The subject of today's summit is very highly relevant. Today's discussion is fighting the next war together. I want to jump right in so we leave a lot of time for questions. But Norway's serious approach to your country's defense and your strong commitment to the NATO alliance are well reflected in your long-term defense plan 2020. Written with your usual Norwegian straightforward appreciation of the situation, and I would call it the harsh realities that General Lars just mentioned, and the situation that faces our democracies and our alliance. In it, your government directly addresses, and I'm quoting here, the increasing threats, challenges, and vulnerabilities that must be met by active policies. Also, that the threats are more serious and that the deterioration in the security environment is happening faster than previously assumed. Think of these words that were used: increasing threats, must be met, active policies, more serious, deterioration happening faster than assumed. As an outsider reading these unembellished assessments of the security situation, a sense of urgency clearly runs through it. I can imagine looking back at my time on active duty, asking myself, if next week is our last week of peace, what should I do to make us as ready as possible? And asking myself that every week. Or as Trotsky put it, you may not be interested in war, but war is certainly interested in you. Besides coming before you with respect for our long history of Allied collaboration, up front, I want to comment on the political status of the alliance. Regardless of any recent political rhetoric broadcast in these tumultuous times that Alicia just mentioned, the U.S. engagement with Europe remains very robust. As we speak, from the Black Sea to the Baltic, from the Balkans to the North Atlantic, American, Canadian, and European troops are working in concert from the democracies to keep us safe. America's engagement remains enduring, as demonstrated by our Congress's actions increasing our level of support for NATO. NATO's adaptability is why it has such longevity, having existed longer than even perhaps the old of us in this conference. Granted, NATO has always had some disagreements. That's natural. Its strength is that it has always overcome those disagreements. And I think that Norwegian-U.S. interactions are a demonstration to the entire alliance that our stance holds fast. For history gives that one enduring lesson that was just quoted when I was introduced about national survival, that nations with allies thrive and nations without allies wither and die. That's reality. 9/11 should have ended any discussion about how any one nation is strong enough to provide for its own security. No nation is strong enough alone. And while democracies go through some very raucous periods, at the end of the day, we Americans will be there with you if danger looms. We will come intact through this tumultuous period in the democracies. This is a normal maturation of democracies as they deal with competing desires by many people and their population. NATO's security measures send a message to all nations about how seriously we take our military collaboration, how seriously we as a people, as democratic peoples, value our freedom, and the steps our military takes to ensure our diplomats' words will be taken seriously, as our diplomats try to resolve differences through essential international organizations and to keep the peace for one more year, one more month, one more week, one more day, one more hour. For it's our alliance's strength that allows our individual nations' leaders to use traditional diplomatic tools to manage disagreements without resort to combat. This summit and your military organizations are critical to such endeavors to keep the peace. For our two nations do recognize that democracy and the importance we place on individual liberty and on the rule of law are under attack. In Norway's case, 8 years after a fascist invasion and occupation, your country was a founding member of NATO. In the years since, you have protected NATO's northern flank as our sentinel, and you've dispatched your well-trained, well-equipped, and ethical troops into the most complex fights. Peacekeeping commitments and development funding further demonstrate Norway's moral leadership on the world stage. Your forces are proven, but elite forces are never complacent if they intend to remain a force to be contended with. The biggest challenge inside the U.S. forces may be similar to what you confront, which is how to better integrate our joint force to gain its full capability. A superb Army alone cannot fight well without an integrated Air Force using Army intelligence in real time. An Air Force with top-line fighter aircraft cannot win wars on its own. And absent a Navy that is also at the top of its game and using its power to throw an enemy off balance means we are not gaining the full utility of our force to end the hostilities swiftly if they break out. Any such disconnect within our own joint force allows our adversaries to find operational gaps to exploit against our forces. A force robustly integrated is not just a force that is the sum of its parts. Employed well in an integrated fashion, a joint force confronts its adversary with cascading dilemmas, with leaders at all levels whose cunning and military prowess achieve intellectual overmatch against our enemies. In modern times, with gray zone challenges growing, the increased speed of operations and emerging technologies, we need increased cooperation. We need even faster exchanges and displays of information and deeper shared operational appreciations for the synergy of our joint and combined forces. And all this must be marked by a spirit of collaboration across all ranks and all headquarters. There is no room for complacency today. For every day, we want our adversaries to assess us, our democracy's militaries. We want them to assess those militaries, say, no, not today. The democracy's militaries are still too strong. Let's not try it today. Urgency Again, read your long-term defense plan, which with no false hysteria calls for adapting today with urgency, not tomorrow, as General Large said, today. This falls primarily to those of you listening who are wearing uniforms. For example, as soldiers, we need to see the work done at Tromsø to enable NATO submarine operations as broadening the competitive space against those who wish us ill, complicating the decision by any enemy who might want to take you on ashore against your army. Seen in this light, NATO's ability to deter war is stronger today thanks to Norway's commitment to NATO's bilateral reinforcement capability from those of us across the Atlantic. We are stronger because of what your nation has done to make that bilateral and alliance reinforcement faster and smoother if and when needed. Let our adversary calculate that if they're thinking about making mischief against Norway. I was heartened to read in your long-term defense plan 2020 that Russia will have to consider that your maneuver battalions will be equipped, as Minister Bok-Jensen just mentioned, with new main battle tanks, a critical consideration for anyone who has designs on your country. Main battle tanks are critical too for ensuring that your troops are well rehearsed and operating with top-line tanks if NATO must respond operationally to a crisis anywhere. Along with the mobile air defenses and long-range precision fires mentioned and called for in your plan, your Army will have the necessary elements to be a strong ground component. Studying history, democracies whose armies lost sight of why they exist, they cease to be relevant to sustaining peace and protecting sovereignty. You can then understand why I'm unsurprised and take heart that the continued, and I quote again from your long-range plan, active policies, priorities, and measures show the seriousness of Norway's national leadership, specifically your Prime Minister, Minister of Foreign Affairs, and Minister of Defense. I remain confident in Norway's military. And why? Not because I'm complacent. It's because with such political leadership support and the spirit captured in the placard on the wall, the one that you adopted in 1949, the same year Norway joined NATO, the placard that clearly guides all hands in a crisis, there can be no doubt that the Norwegian Army knows full well its critical role in the joint force and the Allied mission to protect your homeland's democracy from those who are threatened by our freedoms. I salute each one of you for your continued service, for ultimately it is all about the people. Yes, we need top-notch technology, and numbers too are important. But trust and clarity of mission throughout a well-trained, well-equipped military is a force multiplier. A strong, effective military of willing defenders such as you bring to bear will cool the ardor of any aggressor, causing him to think twice before trying something foolish. For all America's rambunctious political election antics that we are displaying right now, NATO adversaries would be ill-advised to question the commitment of U.S. troops that will come to Europe with the same spirit as when you came to help us following 9/11. As we always have, America stands by NATO. Rest assured, America's troops will come with America's commitment, with courage and competence, with compassion and strength for you, and with unrelenting fury for the adversary if you face attack. They will regret it. It will be their longest day and worst day. For no minor temporary differences that we see right now will blind us to our shared values, and any petty obstacles to mutual cooperation will fall away in the face of an aggressor against any one of us. NATO's collective security will remain based on all alliance nations doing their share with the stamina to sustain doing their fair share. We owe it to the next generations to carry out our responsibilities to turn over our freedoms to them intact. And this shared purpose is why I, an American, am humbled to be included today in the Army Summit. I have seen your troops take less competent troops under their wing, building a sense of confidence and showing ethical discipline on the battlefield where the veneer of civilization is easily rubbed off, leaving bare emotions that must be constrained if we're to live up to our shared values. The lesson that I saw in your troops in those cases lives in me today. It's part of my formative experience. For it's troops like yours who are tactically competent, well-led, well-equipped, maintaining their values and discipline. It's troops like these that send a restraining message to our foes and give our diplomats the best foundation for keeping the peace. For the weak and the timid cannot, at the end of the day, protect the freedom entrusted to us by previous generations. Now, let me close by saying I may not know you personally. I've grown remote from the troops that really matter, the ones who carry the rifles, fly the airplanes, and man the ships. But I do know your character. I know you could all make more money doing something else and live more comfortably than when you train or stand alert north of the Arctic Circle. But on our country's most turbulent days, these experiments in democracy, that's all they are, these experiments that you and I call Norway and America, we all know that our nations are worth the commitment that you young soldiers are making, that our people are better than our politics sometimes show. So while I may be some thousands of kilometers away from Norway right now, we are united as brothers and sisters in keeping freedom alive. And that's our commitment. Let us all go forward together, carrying out our patriotic duties, aligned with each other, committed to working with urgency to be at the top of our grim game, building trust across our joint and allied forces with the fervent hope that our combined strength will contribute to keeping the peace, but knowing that if we must fight, that we will be ready to fight the next war together. We also know the best part of these conferences is the Q&A period, even over this video teleconference. I hope it'll be so again. Thank you, General Lars, for including me. And who has the questions for me?
General Mattis, first things first, what do I call you? Do I call you Jim? Do I call you Lars? Or are you more comfortable with being addressed as generals? This is a test question. So yeah, what do I call you? The floor is yours. What do you prefer?
Please call me Jim.
Excellent. That was a loaded question.
I happily left all those titles behind when I fled Washington, D.C.
But you know what? You deserve them all. So if I can call the gentleman on the screen Jim, I'm sure I can call you Lars.
Yep.
Where do I start, Jim? I mean, I think the best decision Army Summit has made is to invite you because because of your reassuring words about Norway as an ally, about your commitment, as I mentioned earlier, to global alliances and how that is the strength of liberal democracies. There are many questions, but before we go to the number of warships and missiles needed to defend our countries, I'm going to start off with a question that I think a lot of our viewers would like you to answer. You touched a bit upon it, but do you see any risks or drawbacks with the idea of America first and the current administration's ambitions to scale back U.S. global presence and footprint, whether it's in Afghanistan or, for that matter, in Germany?
Yeah, here's the way I would look at this America First piece. America's a big country, as you know, those of you who've driven or flown around it. And it is possible sometimes to just be consumed by the news in America, what's going on in the South, in the North of America, in the East, the West, the Midwest, to the point that in many cases, because we are built heavily on immigration, that people came here purposely to isolate themselves from problems in former places, whether they be economic or freedom, liberty, democracy, lack of democracy. So there's always been an isolationist strain to America. It's always been there. But if I would to sum up the best example for America first, and I'm not saying I even promote that idea because, like I said, I don't know how to defend America without allies. I only studied it 40 years. Maybe there's something out there, but I haven't discovered it yet, how you do that. But you remember every time you get on an airplane and the flight attendant says, in the event you lose cabin pressure, oxygen masks will drop. Put your own mask on first, then help those around you. Please bear with us as we sort through our sometimes isolationist view of the world, when it sometimes seems to be so complex it drives anyone half crazy. We're putting our own mask on, but we will be there to help you. And if you look at the U.S. Congress and the increasing money committed to the defense in NATO, you see the will of the American people still speaking with their actions louder than their words.
Thank you so much, Jim. So now that I have you here, Lars, how reassured are you by Jim's words? I mean,
I'm actually very, very reassured, Jim. And one of the highlights in my almost 30 years in the military has been the last 2 years and the level of integration and training we have done, especially with the US Marine Corps here in Norway. As you have stated, and it's also stated in our long-term plan, we rely for our security on our allies coming to help us if that is needed. The US Marines have shown dedications to come here and train under the very, very harsh Arctic conditions that we are more than pleased to offer. And that has been one important part of it, mastering the conditions. But the most important part from my perspective has been the level of trust we have been able to build. Norwegian soldiers and US Marines sharing dining facilities, sharing gym, sharing hardship out in the field, build relations which I think will be with us for centuries, but also will be very, very important if we will have to fight shoulder to shoulder, be it in Norway or be it in anywhere else.
thank you, Lars. So we have a long list of questions, and the next one is for Jim. We are seeing Russian aggression in the Ukraine, possibly Belarus, and increasingly assertive China in the South China Sea and at the Indian border. What role should the US be playing here, if any?
I think the first and most important point I would make is building on General Lars' reminder that trust is the coin of the realm. Really what we're seeing is the Chinese leader, President Xi, nobody else matters in that country, the Russian leader, Putin, shredding trust between nations, responsible nations. Now, in the case of Russia, it appears that Putin wants unstable countries on his periphery because that's how he gets his security. He sees democracies just by their existence as a threat. Now, he's not some crazed guy who wants to have Russian tanks, I think, to march on various capitals in Europe yet. But he's more a creature out of Dostoevsky who sees Russia surrounded by nightmares. And as such, he responds as an insecure Russian always has. When you look at the PRC, on the other hand, you see a very muscular China treating its own people with authoritarian rules and under authoritarian kind of strictures. So we must assume that's probably the way they see themselves dealing with others. It's almost like both countries want veto authority over the sovereignties, the sovereign decisions, economic decisions, diplomatic decisions, security decisions of surrounding nations. China wants it in a different way of tribute nations, paying tribute. Russia simply wants to disrupt and muscle their way into that decision making. But I think the most important thing here is to understand that problem. And that is why the United States stands by sovereign nations making sovereign decisions, and why we stand so firmly with NATO in the face of these kind of authoritarian impulses.
Thank you, Jim. Lars, We are at the Norwegian Army Summit, and this is a very crucial time in the national defense planning with the ongoing debates, and I'd say, a move away from the traditional consensus around these discussions. In addition, we are living in a pandemic. The global pandemic has shut countries down. Economies are suffering. How can countries like Norway justify an increase in their defense spending when confronted with so many other competing priorities and budgetary pressures? As someone who's right at the center of this debate about defense spending, what is your pitch to get the money you need, to get the soldiers you need, to get the tanks you need?
I think we all, soldiers or not soldiers, recognize that we are in demanding times. And this is not only for Norway, it goes for all the Western world. From my perspective, the question we all need to ask ourselves is, how important is our way of life? How important is economic growth and being able to say what you mean, not actually what you are told to say? From my perspective, that is the reason why we should continue and also to some extent increase the investments in our armed forces, because that is the guarantor for our way of life.
Jim, back to you. I'm sure you're aware of the fact that as the situation is right now, Norway does not meet the force requirements as expected by NATO. You've talked about, all the great and positive aspects of Norway as an ally, punching above its weight. But would you be able to elaborate more on how you see Norway's commitment going forward? What are the United States' expectations to Norway as a responsible ally?
Yeah, this is the kind of question that among trusted allies, this is the sort of discussion we must have. Democracies have no ordained right to survival. It's not like because we're the good guys, then God smiles on us and we live happily ever after. We know that we are going to have to defend these freedoms, and Norway had that rudely forced on them, that reality. When invaded in World War II. And I would also say, though, democracies can afford survival. We have created very prosperous, unbelievably prosperous communities. Private citizens today live better with a higher quality of life in some critical ways, better health care, better living conditions than nobility lived 150 years ago. We take it for granted now, but we should not take for granted the prosperity and the peace that democracies have brought. I'm reminded that Churchill, when asked during World War II, because they were fighting a war, and he was asked, the newsman said, well, we call the last war the Great War, World War I. What should we call this war? And his response was the avoidable war. Why on earth would it have been avoidable? Well, if the democracies had manned up, if they defended themselves in the 1930s, we might never have found ourselves in that position. We owe our troops today. We owe our troops the means to succeed on the battlefield. So what I would say is that after World War II, many nations needed America. I had a foreign ambassador teach me that America made the most self-sacrificial pledge in world history after World War II. And I was sitting there thinking I knew something about American history. I'd never heard that. I said, well, you mean the Marshall Plan? He said, oh, no. He said, the Marshall Plan just shows America's generosity even towards former enemies. You helped Europe get back on feet. He said, no. He said, after World War II, you could have told Europe that's twice in 25 years we got dragged into one of your wars. We're through with you. We're turning to Asia and Latin America and Africa. We're shifting our trade, our interest, our diplomatic priorities to these other places. He said, instead, you pledged 100 million dead Americans in a nuclear war to protect democracy in Western Europe. He said, and I never learned this in America. I needed a foreigner to explain, to teach me this. I think what we have to say today is we cannot ask American parents to make sacrifices and to care more about European children's future freedom than European parents care. That if we're going to make sacrifices up around 3.5% of our GDP for defense, then the Wales pledge of 2% means we all have to work together on this. And I know it's difficult. I understand that parliaments and democracies have their own cultural challenges, their own political challenges. But the bottom line is we'd better look at the sense of urgency that's captured in your government's document and match that urgency to action. That's how I see it going. And I think that it's going to be very hard to convince the Americans to continue putting off funding for education and healthcare unless everyone's carrying their fair share of the load.
That is perfectly understandable and a very clear message to the Norwegian audience, and I'm sure you're very pleased with that, Lars. You talked about in your speech earlier how Norway does not meet the force requirements. For someone, I mean, aside from the politics of it, what practical implications does this shortfall have for Norway's security?
Thank you. First of all, NATO's force requirement is that Norway is to stand up a fully mechanized brigade. And as stated by the Secretary of Defense, this means adding another maneuver battalion to Brigade North. It means investing in new main battle tanks, new armored vehicles, new artillery and long-range fires. And I'm very, very glad to hear what he stated just a few minutes ago, that this is an important part of the long-term plan. What does it give us? From my perspective, it reduces risks in two ways. First of all, it reduces the risk in the armies and therefore the armed forces' ability to defend Norway. It gives us increased presence, it gives us increased readiness, and it adds endurance. This is especially important because the Norwegian army and also the heavy parts of the Norwegian army are probably the only ones being, at least among the very, very few, being capable of operating this kind of equipment, these kind of units in the high north. The other risk mitigating effort is linked to NATO. Standing up this brigade will in itself signal to NATO that we are serious, but it also reduces the risk involved when we contribute forces to the Very Joint Task Force, to EFP in the Baltics, or any kind of other international operations, which is a way of showing that we are a part of the alliance.
And we're committed, yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, bear with me, Jim, because I know that you guys would probably like to talk about technical capabilities of land forces, but since we live in a democracy and the process through which we vet questions is that people can like the most popular question. And the most popular question right now is the following one. In the event of a re-election of Donald Trump, what is the realistic future of NATO cooperation where allies can count on the US? How realistic is it for the US to stand behind us with Donald Trump as president?
Yeah, you know, the reality is, Alicia, that America is a very unusual country. After our nasty argument with King George III, we set up a government intentionally to compete with each other. We did not want to replace one king with a very efficient government that would work smoothly together. So when you watch the US Congress raising the amount of money being spent on NATO defense, when you watch the kind of activities that are going on with Bold Quest and the shifting around of troops, the question is, where in Europe are we going to put those troops? When you watch the level of collaboration that natural alignment brings, there's a momentum inside our government, and there's a larger momentum that even in the most raucous periods, we will find more common ground than we'll find uncommon ground. Remember that the first time I can read about American political dissatisfaction with what the then President John F. Kennedy called freeloaders was John F. Kennedy. Now, Alicia, from the looks of you were not even born, and this issue was already out there, okay? And we have stuck through it all these years, and we have found a way to overcome it. Like I said, NATO's always had disagreements. And yes, these are some more fundamental and at times more starkly drawn from the American side. But the fact is, we're there, we will be there, and we will still be there 4 years from now, no matter what the results of the American election, because it's in our interest that we be there. Besides building on the shared values, it's in our interest. So we will be there, and I would put less into what the words are that you see in the news each day, and look at the actions that are going on each day, and watch the Congress, which holds the purse strings, and they are obviously raising what the president asked for NATO each time they deal with the budget, and it's up to them, thanks to the way our government works. So keep the faith. As Winston Churchill put it so aptly, you can trust the Americans to do the right thing once they've exhausted all possible alternatives.
You know what, Jim? This is actually, I may not have been born back then, but I'm fully alive now. And I think this is a really good, an important reminder to look beyond the headlines. So in you, we trust right now. I do have some questions that I think you'll be happy to answer that are not as political, but this one is, MBTs are a crucial capability. How do you view the United States Marine Corps Commandant Directive to remove them from the USMC? How might that impact US operations in Norway? Jim, that one's for you as well.
Yeah. As you know, the Marines are a naval force, and there's always the challenge of what can you get on ships and what can you land and what can you support when you're in these operations. But we also have to recognize in the last 15 years, what you can do with wheeled vehicles, what you can do with active defense measures, electronic defense measures in terms of protection of vehicles is a lot different. We can move those vehicles in places that the heavy main battle tanks cannot go, especially on board ship and getting them off the ships. They can maneuver over terrain that 15 years ago, even 6- and 8-wheeled light armored vehicles, wheeled vehicles could not. Further, I think that this is one of the reasons why, remember, the Marines being a naval force cannot be exactly like a full land combat force. This is one of the strengths that, for example, the Norwegian military would bring if we have to do a reinforcement there. But also that we rely heavily on our Marine air wings with their Joint Strike Fighters, the F-18s, and this sort of thing. So it's a very integrated force, and it's designed for a lot of things. But rest assured, if the U.S. is coming, there will be tanks there. And the U.S. Army, we've fought alongside U.S. Army tanks many times. So don't worry about it. We'll be there, and we'll have a lot of guns. And we have this old idea that if you're going into a gunfight, bring all your friends with guns, and our Marines will be clamoring to get on board and get over to Norway fast if it were needed.
Well, it's good to know that you bring friends to your gunfight. I bring knives. No, that is just a silly joke. Lars, I know you're very eager to respond to what Jim just said.
I couldn't agree more, Jim. From my perspective, the point here is that by the U.S. Marines evolving and increasing their capabilities as a naval force, we will together be a more efficient and lethal balanced force. And again, based on the last 2 years of experience, I'm all for the development that the Marine Corps is following, while at the same time we are following and ensuring that there will be a mechanized force in country to fight shoulder to shoulder with the Marines, if that is necessary.
So we're running over time, but I'm assuming that Jim and Lars are both so invested in this conversation that they could go on for another couple of minutes. Here is an interesting question to both of you. Lars, you can go first. What are Norwegian and US views on Svalbard, its economic and security environment, Russian influence, and potential for conflict and future US investment?
Svalbard is Norwegian sovereign territory.
Oh. And?
Yeah, there are economic developments, there are issues described in the Svalbard Treaty, but if you boil it all down, Svalbard is Norwegian sovereign territory.
Jim?
We see no difference between Oslo and any other part of the country. It's all Norway. End of discussion. We stand with you.
Well, again, I mean, this has just been a long line of reassuring words. And, well, and time flies in good company. But I know, Lars, that you wanted to take the opportunity to ask Jim a question. He spoke a bit about the topic earlier, but I'm going to let you have the last question of today's Q&A.
Thank you very much. Jim, first of all, thank you very, very much for sharing some of your wisdom. We should have hours or more, so we'll see if we can do something next year. But again, my question is, based on your broad military experience, what is the most important piece of advice you would give to the young Norwegian and American officers and NCOs starting on their military service? What's the most important thing you would recommend to them?
General Lars, probably that they must take responsibility for their own development as human beings, as military leaders. They will be well trained. They will be very well trained in the Norwegian forces and the American forces. We know how to train for war. It's something we're both good at. But the more important thing is that they must educate themselves for the things we cannot anticipate. They are going to have to take responsibility and use their initiative, because if they don't use their initiative in studying more broadly, if they don't take their own initiative and apply it to knowing their military skills to a point of high degree of competency, they cannot fully manifest as leaders. And young troops in democracies, in our armies, they do not look up simply because someone has rank. They look up because they see someone who knows what they're doing, who knows them and knows their job so well that they know that that boss above them cares about them. And at that point, they then turn all their attention to the mission and the enemy. But they have to have trust that their leaders cared enough about them and their job that they mastered their work. So you'll be well trained, but for the young NCOs, the young officers, make sure that you're educating yourself for the unknown. In the Marines, we have a reading list that changes at each rank as you go up, and there's another set of books. Even generals got a new list of books they have to read. So make sure you're taking advantage of this opportunity in peace, because you're going to get audited. Just assume a war is coming. And when that audit comes, you don't want to be found lacking. You don't want to have that hollow pit in your stomach knowing you could have been in better physical shape, mental shape, or spiritual shape for the test that combat will throw at you. But at the same time, General Lars, thanks so much for including me. I am humbled to be back among the great Norwegians. You know, and I know that we can't even talk publicly about just how tight the bond is and all the things we do together. But rest assured that we know what we owe you, and we'll be there with you.
Jim, I'm actually going to push for having you on next year's Army Summit, and I'm also going to push to be back myself so I can actually have you in the same room as me. You have given us so many inspiring words, and we're really, really grateful for your presence. But our time has unfortunately come to an end. Thank you to both of you, Jim and Lars, for really setting the agenda. And I think your words are not in vain. I think they are going to be listened to by all. And that makes for a really good start of this year's Army Summit. Thank you so much for being here. Please join us at the same time tomorrow when the chiefs of the Norwegian Army, Navy, and Air Force will share their thoughts on the future of joint operations. This is the first time the chiefs are meeting and discussing this with a public audience. And I, for one, am really excited to join in on their discussion. The session tomorrow will be in Norwegian, so unless the audience has some crash course in Norwegian lined up tonight, we encourage you to tune in again on Wednesday. We will be back on Wednesday with a very relevant discussion on the topics of resilience and uncertainty, featuring General Ben Hodges from the Center of European Policy Analysis, and also former commander, U.S. Army Europe, as well as our eminent Minister of Foreign Affairs, Ine Eriksen Søreide. Thank you and enjoy the rest of your evening.